Hello everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Talking the Red. So today we're going to go ahead and jump right into the new Savage Rage that dropped this morning. We're going to go ahead and start with E1, that is Eden Prime. It's a very fun, very hectic fight, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the Red Mage changes that dropped with this patch as we go through the fight as well. But don't want to waste too long giving you guys an intro, so let's go ahead and get right to it. So go ahead and do a 15-second pull timer here. As usual, I will go ahead and start my acceleration at around 7 seconds and my actual precasting at 5. Now, Red Mages have had our mana cost reduced pretty much across the board for all of our major spells, so you'll notice that I'm not having to cast Lucid Dreaming on cooldown anymore, which is pretty handy. I still try and do it around 7,500 or so, but for the most part it's very, very manageable unless you're just doing a ton of reses. Now, if you're really lucky with your crits here, you can go ahead and do a modification, get into your melee combo. Unfortunately, I had to use a swift cast. If you have to use a swift cast, you're not going to have enough time to drop these gravity wells. The gravity wells are going to target all of the DPS. We found it easiest just to move them somewhat into the corners, just make a little bit of room for this first phase. It does get a little bit more complicated later. After that, DPS mostly stays south, and then the tanks will stay north. As you can see, one is north, one is east as they get hit with their giant laser tank busters here. Pretty easy to avoid. The next phase, the next target is going to hit a couple of healers. Basically, that is a Baton Pass. So the healers are going to run to the tanks, as you can see there on A and D, and pass it off to the tanks from there. Now, these mechanics are going to change up a little bit in the second phase, but for the most part, it's really not too complicated for this first portion here. Nothing really out of the ordinary from what we saw in the normal version. The room-wide AoE there, the pure light, still pretty much the same, very easy to avoid, nothing extra added there. Delta attack is still the same, you'll want to move to the corners. However, the cardinal direction AoEs, as you can see, they are mostly invisible. It's a giant lightning strike. So you do need to make sure that you are not standing directly north, south, east, or west. Now here's the first really complicated mechanic here, this first dimensional shift. So here we actually assigned each person a bubble just like you do on Titania. For whatever reason, I managed to kind of skip this mechanic. I don't know if it's because it was in my melee combo whenever the mechanic went out. I noticed that it does happen quite a bit whenever I'm doing that, so it could be a possible way to cheese it a little bit. But for everyone else, they're going to be chased by these giant circle AoEs. They're very slow, so they're pretty easy to avoid. You just have to make sure just kind of hang around your local bubble as much as possible and be there ready to go as soon as possible whenever it's done. The orbs will target whoever is closest at the time. That becomes incredibly important the next time we see them here in a little bit. Beyond that, go straight into our Fragor Maximus. Now you'll notice I haven't used my Embolden yet, and I didn't use my melee combo. That's because the DPS check for this particular section is fairly difficult. There's no tethers on the ads or anything like that. There's only really one major mechanic to worry about, but their actual wipe mechanic is much, much faster this time around, so you have to be on top of everything. So now I go ahead and use my Embolden, try and get as much DPS out as possible on these guys, rather than try wasting it on the boss early on. I can just use a normal melee combo just fine before this. Beyond that, they do have a mana booster. I'm not sure if you saw it cast there or not, but it does need to be interrupted by each of the tanks. That is only cast once. Once that is done, you're pretty much safe from there as long as you are meeting the DPS check. Thankfully, I think our Machinist and Dragoon were both pulling around 11k or so at this point. Mine wasn't too far behind, but it did slow down quite a bit more as the fight went on because of all the movement, and I did have a couple reses going on throughout the fight in the second phase coming up. So not quite the DPS that I wanted from it, but for being a first run, I'm pretty happy with it. I did end up winning an earring from it a little bit later, so that'll help out a little bit in the long run too. But as I was saying, the Red Mage changes were fairly simple, mostly mana reduction across the board. We did get Enchanted Reprise, a little buff, so the mana cost has been reduced down to 5 mana each, and the potency was increased from 220 to 250. I still haven't really found a decent reason to use it yet. even on fights with a lot of movement, you're usually having to stay fairly far away from the boss for a lot of these mechanics, so it's still kind of difficult to find a reason to use it instead of just using my alternative displacement or something along those lines for most of these fights. Now here's where things get kind of tricky. So here in a second he's going to cast Paradise Regain, there it is. So it kind of changes up everything. He gets a massive increase to his magic damage, and from here on we kind of stack for everything. This first phase, the big laser tank buster, we need to stack for that, and then the gravity wells kind of disappear, but they are targeted with Vice and Virtue for this alternative method here. So we just had everyone pair up and go to one of the cardinal directions with assigned spots and soak up those debuffs quite a bit. Instead of the healer debuff that we saw a little bit earlier where they do the Baton Pass, instead it's going to be a big debuff that that actually gives you a ton of debuffs like poison and whatnot. You'll also notice the delta attack changed. Instead of running to the corners and spreading out, we actually had to run in because it is a giant donut AoE as long as the Paradise Regained debuff is up for the boss. There you go. So pretty basic tank buster and everything from there, and then as you can see his buff disappears. Now here's where things get really tricky. So the orbs are kind of back. You're going to notice those arcane spheres, those do need to be DPS down. Now the spinning orbs are going to fire giant spinning lasers that are way too fast to dodge. So what we had to do is we actually had to designate a few party members to basically bait them to try and get them to turn away from the center, as you can see there. It's really the only way that I've seen it done so far. Obviously I've only cleared it once or twice at this point, but that seems to be the most effective method. Got a res up there on the Dragoon. Beyond that, if you're not baiting the orbs as much as possible, then just stay as close to center as you can, or basically hug the arcane spheres just to DPS them down and then get to center as quickly as possible. They really don't have a whole lot of health, so it's not too crazy to deal with. Most of our DPS were able to solo one down if they really had to. Now from here you're basically repeating the phase 1 mechanics. Everything else goes back to normal. A lot of donut AoEs, as you can see. The only major change for this one from phase 1 is that the gravity wells, when they return, we cannot drop them in the corner this time. The gravity wells are going to be followed immediately by a delta attack, so we drop the gravity wells in the cardinal directions. That way the corners had enough room to avoid the delta attack going out. So as you can see, I went south, lost a little bit of DPS because I had to move back to the northeast corner. But for the most part, nothing too complicated once you get the hang of it. At this point, it's just really memorizing everything. You know, one mechanic right after the other. Once you get the hang of it, it's really not too bad. The hardest part, I would say, is going to be the orbs. Now, after this Vice and Virtue, we're going to have another dimensional shift and actually get a second round of these spinning orbs. The hardest part for this, more than anything, is that you really cannot have anyone down. A tank is okay because they don't normally get targeted by the bubbles anyways, from what we've noticed, but if you have any DPS down, that means you're going to be missing either DPS on the arcane spheres or missing out on someone who is baiting the orbs. If you have anyone down, it basically just wipes the raid. These lasers will one-shot you, so it is incredibly important that you get them faced away from the center as best as possible. Alright, and back to the corner for another Pure Light. And I believe I res the tank at this point. Yeah, there we go. And then from there, it's fairly easy. The hardest part, more than anything, aside from learning the orb mechanic, was just the DPS. It is a very, very rough DPS check for the most part. We did hit Enrage several times before we got to this point, including a couple 1% wipes. So it's very, very tight. We had to average, I would say, around 10k or so when the boss is actually up, 10 to 10.5. Unfortunately, a lot of the logs are kind of messed up right now. Most of my logs got uploaded as showing BLM casts. I don't know why. So I don't know exactly what the average DPS was. Now he does cast Paradise Regained again, so it's back to the stack mechanics and just back and forth at this point. Essentially, if you can get past that second orb phase, it's just a matter of cleaning things up at that point and making sure you have the DPS to do it. The weakness debuff is incredibly hurtful throughout this fight, at least early on. As people get geared up, obviously it'll be less and less important, but it is a fairly hard DPS check. But that is Eden 1 Savage. Hope you guys got a decent look at the fight, kind of see what it's like as a red mage. If you have any questions or comments, have any ideas or other strats, feel free to leave them in the comments. But happy raiding. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in the next 3, and I will see you there.